Oh, and good evening. It's February 25th, right, 2025, and we're continuing our discussion collection, our Outside the Class series. This series is from the Bible Project, and it covers the entire TaNaK, right, that Old Testament. On TheDustyFeet.com, in the Outside the Class section, all of those source videos are set up for your review. Because the intent of Outside the Class is for you to listen to that in-class lecture first. All those lectures can be found in that source video playlist. Because we're going to try to keep these to about just 15 minutes. We'll make them easy to catch up on. So we are on a quest, scroll by scroll, book by book, a journey through this collection, but with a fun and different twist on Outside the Class, on the Dusty Feet. And of course, before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful to you, then please click that subscribe button. But those reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, then that's when you click that like button, because that is how YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So, remember, the videos we're going to be discussing, they're just the tip of an iceberg. They are part of a learning series that I highly recommend. And of course, they can all be found on that Bible Project website. Because we're going to ask many questions about all kinds of things. Answers? We'll see. Judges, Shoftim, this is part 6. We finished last week with Gideon and his 300 men in chapter 7, right? And they blew their trumpets. There was confusion. It's not the only time that God used that tactic. We have friendly fire, and then in the mortal words of Monty Python, run away! Run away! There is the pursuit of those leaders. We have their capture. We have the chopping off of heads. There's probably more there to discuss. Probably going to do that at another time. But we've seen this so many times in Scripture. In a part here, the naming of a place that's mentioned as part of the event, right? Oreb is killed at the rock of Oreb. Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. Convenient that they're in such places when they die. Remember Gideon's call of the people, right? He called them. God ended up sending all but 300 away. But then later on in the story, as Gideon pursues more of the enemy, those men of Ephraim, who were living in the hills in fear, right? They criticize Gideon for not involving them. Please, go read chapter 8, verse 3. And there's a Strong's number, if you can, look it up. It's H6213A. That's H6213A. It's the word asa. In the NASB, they turn that word into the phrase, in comparison with you. I might encourage you to examine some of these interesting phraseologies in your English. Consider other thoughts, other ideas that fall from those. So use your Strongs. Remember, it's not a dictionary. It just shares the English words used in other translation points. Because I think it's going to bring up even more points for you to discuss amongst yourselves. But as we continue in the chapter, it becomes apparent that the other leaders in the area, right, they seem to not entirely support Gideon. Remember, Gideon's men are tired. They're hungry. So they approach these leaders in the area they come up on called Sukkot, right? There's so much wrapped up when you understand the connections with Sukkot. We don't even have near enough time to get into it here, but I highly suggest that you see the connections as to why we're talking about these leaders in Sukkot, and maybe even why food, why bread is involved. But suffice it to say that Gideon asked for food. And they went, why should we give you food? Have you won the victory? I mean, their concern is that he hasn't won yet, so why should I give you anything? He's one of theirs. That's a twisted thought. I mean, so Gideon's response, right? It too is not a pretty picture. I mean, it tells him, okay, so when I'm done with the battle, I'm going to come back. I'm going to come down. I'm going to beat you with the foliage of your area. So he battles, he chases, he continues to chase. He captures those guys. He kills the leaders he's been chasing. And then on his way back, right, he captured a young man from Sukkot. And he asks him for the names of all the elders. Kid, probably being wise, he tells Gideon the names of the princes and the elders. And that group, that consisted of 70 men. Again, there's no time to discuss here. But a group of 70 elders, this is not the only time we see that. So you know there's got to be more connections there. Because I think, in keeping with what Rabbi Foreman of another group also continues to remind us in his teachings, he always brings this back to us. Where have we heard this before in the entirety of Scripture? Yeah. Well, suffice to say that in this very messy, awkward, uncomfortable story, Gideon did as he promised. He finds the elders, beats them, then he tears down a tower, and he then confronts the kings that they battled. And then we get to this fascinating but more confusing, awkward, very uncomfortable part. Because Gideon's in battle heat. I mean, he's hot. He's mad because he hasn't gotten the support from the local people. They've caused him pain. He's had to deal with all of that, and he's dealing with pursuing these leaders. And then he has two more that, well, he wants dead. But for some reason, Gideon decides to have his son do the deed, right? His job was to put the leaders to the sword. And he gets nasty here. I mean, his firstborn, Jether, right? He asks him to do this. Scripture doesn't say how old he is. It only infers that he's young because he said that he did not want to draw the sword. He was afraid because he was just still a youth. It's an awkward picture. But then in Judges chapter 8, verse 21, we get this last taunt before the death of these leaders, right? We've seen this taunt. We've seen it in movies. We see it in our war stories. To us, it's a very familiar taunt, right? The leaders, they say, hey, you're the man. Be the man. You kill us. So Gideon does. After Gideon kills the men, now the people turn around and now they say, hey, now that you've done that, we want you to be our leader. Gideon declines. Gideon says, I'm not going to be your leader. My sons, they're not going to be your leader. But the Lord, He'll be your leader. That sounds like a good start. I mean, we like the phrase. But then, as Paul Harvey says, we get to the rest of the story again. So Gideon says, hey, give me a little bit of your spoil. He asks for one earring, right? But the Ishmaelites, they seem to like gold earrings, so Gideon asked each of them for one. And the total was 1,700 shekels, right? That's just under 43 pounds. 43 pounds of gold. So Gideon, he makes an ephod. He sets the ephod up in the town that he's from, right? Oprah. We had that, right? And then we get to an interesting, messy verses towards the end of chapter 8, verses 27 and 28. And Gideon, he made it into an ephod, placed it in his city, Ophrah. And all Israel played the harlot with it there, so that it became a snare to Gideon and his household. So Midian was subdued before the sons of Israel. They did not lift their heads anymore. And the land was undisturbed for 40 years in the days of Gideon. In our current vernacular, that would be, well, that's bad news and then good news. So whatever Gideon did, it became a snare. It was ugly. I'm going to leave it up for discussion amongst yourselves of what you might think that snare is. I mean, was it that it made him more maybe egotistical, thought he was more powerful? Did it remind Gideon and his son of their contentious connection? Did it cause a strain within his family? Whatever it wasn't good. But then, that's the bad and the good, but then, because of the battle and those other events, Midian was subdued, right? The land remained undisturbed for 40 more years. Then we get to the end of chapter 8 and the death of Gideon. Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and lived in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons who were his direct descendants, for he had many wives. But his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son. His name, Abimelech. And Gideon, the son of Joash, died at a ripe old age, and he was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Then it came about, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the sons of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals, and made Baal Berith their god. Thus the sons of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all of their enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness to the household of Jerubbaal, that's Gideon, in accord with the good that he had done in Israel. We've seen this cycle before. We're going to continue to see it, not just in the scroll of Judges, but this is a pattern that we see in the scroll of Judges. So I just think we need to look at it and see this as it continues to unroll and it continues to go down through time, because I think we're going to see where the pattern continues. Maybe all the way to us. But if you think that pattern's messy, just wait to get to chapter 9, where we're going to talk about Abimelech, that son of Jerubbaal, the one from the concubine in Shechem. Because next week, we're going to get into this messy, very twisted story. It's interesting how the NASB uses section headings, right? Remember, those aren't in Scripture. But we like adding titles. We like captions. We like headers. So this section, the Abimelech conspiracy, that should be interesting, right? Because we even have an analogy, a metaphor, a parable that we need to unfold. So thanks for being with us tonight on another episode of Outside the Class with our Scroll of Judges on the Dusty Feet.